Hi, and welcome back to section 1.1, Introduction to Algebra. In the previous section, we covered add and subtract. Now in this section, we're going to cover multiply and divide. So, before we go into the examples, one thing we have to remember is to pay close attention to the setup and the order. Now let's take a look at the first example. It says 3 times m. Now, as I stated before, we're going to be covering multiply. So when it says time, we're going to be working with the multiplication. So when it says 3 times m, in the higher level math, so we're going to use, instead of the typical multiplication sign as we have seen from middle school, in the upper level math, we're going to be using the dot for times or for multiplication. So when it says 3 times m, it's going to look like this, 3 with a dot in the middle and m. So that means 3 times m. However, we don't usually leave it like that. When you see something like that or write it like what we have here, we're simply going to write it as 3m. Now let's take a look at the next example. It says the product of w and 6. Now, in the previous section, the previous example where we did add and subtract, when we have the operation, which is product is another term for multiply, and here we have the word and. Now, in the other sections that we covered, when we have and, whatever that is in the front, we will write that first, and whatever we have at the end, we write that second. So if you were to translate it and write it out literally, you would have w times 6. Now when it comes to multiplication, we can't just leave it like that. So in your upper level math classes, we're going to rewrite it and leave it as 6w. Now, you would only do this for multiplication. So repeat, we only do this for multiplication. So in the first example and in the second example, we have 3m and 6w. Now regardless, whichever starts first, the 3 or the w, and whatever that comes second, the m or the 6, we're going to rewrite it as what we have for the first two examples. Now moving on to the third example, twice of f. So twice of f is also known as 2 times of f. So twice means 2. So when it says 2 times of f, it's going to be just like the first example, 2f. Now let's move on to the last example. It says triple of k. So when it says triple of k, it means 3 times of k. So triple is another word for 3. And since we have it here where it says 3 times of k, it's similar to the first example and the third example. So you're going to write your answer as 3k. So when it says twice, it means 2. When you see triple, it means 3. So make sure you remember that. Pretty easy to remember. Now we're on the next section, which is divide. So that means we're going to be using the division sign. So just as I mentioned for addition and subtraction, the order is very important for division. So let's pay close attention on how we set it up and the order that we wrote our answer in. So here it says the quotient of m and 7. Now, I know that in multiplication, we didn't really pay close attention to the order. So let me go back to the example for multiplication. So here, for example, it says the product of w and 6, and it had the word and. So since w was in the front and 6 is at the end, usually we would follow this particular order in terms of add, subtract. Now for multiplication, we can't just leave it like that, we just rewrite it as 6w. Now if we go back to divide. Here we have the quotient of m and 7, and we have the word and. So when it comes to quotient, it will definitely be like add and subtract. So whatever's in the front of and, that's going to be first. In this case, the m. And whatever is at the end or after and, in this case the 7, that's going to be written second. So when it says the quotient of m and 7, we're going to write as m divided by 7. Now, when it comes to divide, you can write it horizontally, or you can rewrite it as a fraction. M over 7, it still also means as m divided by 7. So when you see a fraction, it usually means that it's dividing. Now let's move on to the next example, 4 divided by m. So 4 divided by m, again, order is very important. So when you have divided by in the middle, whatever that is in the front, in this case the 4, that will go first. And then what you have at the very end, after divided by, in this case, the m, that will go second. So when we write it out, and as I stated before, the 4 is first, the m is second, we're going to have 4 divided by m. And as I mentioned before in the first example, instead of writing horizontally, you can write it as a fraction or vertically. 4 over m. Now pay close attention to the order. So whatever that is written first, in this case the m, so in the first example the m is first, so the m will be in the numerator or top of the fraction. The 7 is second, so that will be the bottom part or the denominator of the fraction. In the second example, the 4 is first, so therefore if you write it as a fraction, the 4 will be in the top or the numerator. The m was written second, so therefore the m would be at the bottom or the denominator of the fraction. Now moving on to the third example, divided by. So the third example is similar to the second example. Now, I switched the x and the 2, so again here, just because in the second example the 4 is first, doesn't mean that the number is always going first. Here in the third example, I want to bring up that the x is in the front, so if we have divided by, if we follow the same order as we did in the second example, we should set it up according to what we have in this phrase. So in divided by, since the x is in the front, we're going to write that first. And since the 2 is after divided by, we're going to write that second. So we're going to write it as x divided by 2. Now if you were to write it as a fraction, since x is first, we're going to put that in the top or the numerator. And since 2 is second, we're going to put that as the bottom or denominator of the fraction, so x over 2. Now, I want to introduce a little complex example involving with division. So in the next example, it says the sum of 5 and n divided by g. So what I want you to pay close attention is, since it's the sum of 5 and n, that means that the 5 and the n goes together. Then here you see there's a comma introducing a second operation, which is divided by g. So let's take a look at the first operation, the sum. So it says the sum of 5 and n. So we're simply going to write 5 plus n. Now here, I included parentheses because I want to emphasize that the 5 and the n goes together. Now after we put the closed parenthesis, we're going to follow with the second operation, which is divided by. So we put the division sign and then followed by g. So when you write it horizontally, like you have here, you do have to include parentheses. Without parentheses, then your answer is going to mean a different thing. So when it means a different thing, that means you're giving me a different answer. So when you have multiple operation, in this case the sum of 5 and n, if you want to emphasize that the 5 and the n goes together, you have to put it inside a set of parentheses. Now, here we have it written horizontally. If you write it as a fraction, whatever is in the parentheses, and since it's first in front of the division sign, we're going to put that as the top, the numerator of the fraction, and the g, which is written after the division sign, that will be in the bottom, or the denominator of the fraction. So here we have 5 plus n over g. So just like addition, just like subtraction, for division, make sure that you pay very close attention to the order.